Hello there, and welcome to General Psychology. I'm going to talk to you today about the brain and the nervous system and a little bit about the endocrine system. Let me go ahead and share my screen. I hope you can see everything okay. Today we're going to talk about biopsychology, which is chapter 3. It's the intersection between biology and psychology, or how the brain and nervous systems help to control our feelings, our thoughts, and our behaviors. These are going to be our topics. We're going to talk about cells of the nervous system, start with just the very basic cells of the brain, and then we'll talk about some of the divisions of the nervous system, the brain and the spinal cord, some parts of the brain, and then the endocrine system. So here, let's go ahead and get started. What is your brain made up of? Well, it's made up of neurons, which is a type of cell similar to other body cells, but a little bit different. And these neurons communicate with one another, and they do so electrochemically. That means they're going to be using electricity, and they're also going to be using a chemical. That chemical is going to be called a neurotransmitter. There are different parts of a neuron. There are dendrites, there's the soma, there's the axon, and there's a membrane that surrounds the neuron, and there is the myelin that surrounds the axon. So you can pause and kind of see some of these parts. The dendrites here, the soma, and the nucleus here is going to contain the DNA of the cell, just like any other cell would. But on a neuron, you have an axon, and surrounding that axon is the myelin sheath. And then at the very end here is where we're going to see at those axon terminal, where we're going to see that chemical being released. Here's some different types of neurons, and you can see they all look a little bit different, but they all have a lot in common. They all have dendrites, they all have cell bodies, and they all have axons. So now we're going to move into some of the functions of those different parts of the neuron. Neurons are going to communicate, as I talked about earlier. There's some electrical conduction that goes through the neuron, and then in between neurons, there is a transmission of a chemical. That chemical, again, is called a neurotransmitter, and then the next neuron has electrical conduction again. So the dendrites of the neuron here, out here at the edge on these dendrites, they're going to pick up chemical messages coming from another neuron. And then the axon, and then there's going to be electricity going all the way through that axon. And at the end of the axon, it's going to release a chemical and kind of do it all over again. The dendrites then pick up the chemical, and then electricity shoots down the axon, and then the axon is going to release a chemical. And it is through these coordination of different neurons talking to other neurons that we feel anything, that we have any emotions, that we have any thoughts. This is the basics of how our brain works. The space in between neurons, these neurons are not actually connected to each other. There's a little space in there, and the space is called a synapse. Now, if you watch some of the videos that I've listed on Canvas, you can kind of see a little bit more about how these neurons are going to emit that chemical, and the chemical floats across a synapse and gets picked up by the next set of dendrites. So how does neural communication work? Well, the dendrites are going to get a signal, and that's going to be a chemical signal, a neurotransmitter. And that neurotransmitter may or may not be enough energy to start the next neuron firing or putting out that electrical signal through the axon. But if it does, if it's enough, then it will cause the electrical signal in this next neuron. And we call that enough threshold. And so if the chemical will produce enough stimulation, then we get this electrical charge through the neuron. If that happens, then this neuron will release a neurotransmitter here onto this neuron. And once again, it may or may not hit threshold, but if it does hit threshold, if it's enough stimulation, then this neuron will then send an electrical signal down its axon. That electrical signal we call an action potential. So when electricity shoots down the axon, we call that an action potential. And the chemical it spits out at the end, we call a neurotransmitter. The response is all or none, meaning either it happens or it doesn't, but it always, always happens at the same strength. Every single time it happens, it's going to put out that neurotransmitter. It's going to be the same exact strength every time it happens. So what happens after the action potential? Well, here's the end of the axon. We've got electricity coming down here. These are going to be neurotransmitters in the end of the axon. Those are going to come out into the synapse, which is the space in between neurons. And this receptor is on the dendrite of the next neuron. And so the receptor then picks up these chemicals, and it causes, again, if it's enough stimulation, it will cause an action potential in that next neuron. If not, then it will just end there. But once this neurotransmitter is released and it does its job, then it actually gets sucked up by this sending neuron again. And we call that reuptake. It's kind of like a vacuum cleaner recycling process. It gets sucked back up, and then it gets repackaged into these little bubbles, and then it can work again in the same way. So when the axon sucks up the neurotransmitter for later use, we call that reuptake. So how do drugs work? Well, basically drugs work by imitating some of these chemical processes. Either they block the chemicals in the brain, or they act like the chemicals in the brain. So drugs like marijuana, like heroin, even drugs like nicotine, alcohol, they all work by influencing certain kinds of chemicals. So we classify those drugs as either what we call agonists or antagonists. The agonists will mimic the neurotransmitters. They'll strengthen the effects of a neurotransmitter. So a neurotransmitter example of one might be serotonin. A serotonin agonist will increase the amount of available serotonin. It will strengthen the effects of serotonin. Whereas the antagonist might block serotonin and actually make the effect less. So it's going to weaken the effect. So let's take a look at some of the neurotransmitters and some of the drugs. Our first neurotransmitter we'll look at is dopamine. Dopamine seems to be involved in the pleasure response. It is also involved in movement. And so we see a lack of dopamine in problems like Parkinson's disease, where people might have trouble moving. We also see a lot of dopamine in cases of addictive drugs. So almost every addictive drug, alcohol, nicotine, heroin, cocaine, all of those are going to bring up dopamine quite a bit. So we see a lot of dopamine with methamphetamine and stuff like that. And because it causes that kind of pleasurable response, we get easily addicted to it. Some drugs block dopamine, and those drugs are used for schizophrenia because with schizophrenia, it appears that there's too much dopamine activity as well. Serotonin is our next neurotransmitter, and serotonin is involved in mood, and it's also involved in appetite. Some very, very common antidepressant drugs are called the SSRIs, or selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. Those are agonists, meaning that they increase the available amount of serotonin, and they tend to improve our mood. They tend to make us feel a little bit happier, a little less depressed. Endorphins are another neurotransmitter, and they're involved primarily in pain relief. And so we see that certain drugs like the opiates, so those are drugs like heroin, like fentanyl, like hydrocodone, those are agonists, meaning they bring up the available amount of endorphins, and they have a tendency to decrease pain, decrease tension, relax people, and stuff like that. Okay, we're going to get into divisions of the nervous system, and then we'll have one more video on the brain. Okay, divisions of the nervous system. There are several ways in which the nervous system breaks down. So all of the nerves in the body are represented here in gray and also in yellow. So you can see that some nerves run right up the center of the body, the brain and the spinal cord. Those are in gray. That we call the central nervous system. Other nerves are coming out of the sides. They are coming out from the spinal cord and coming out from the brain. And those we call the peripheral nervous system, with peripheral meaning to the side. The peripheral nervous system will further break down, and it breaks down into what we call the autonomic nervous system and the somatic nervous system. So all of those nerves going out to your body, some of them are going to be attached to your muscles, and that's going to help you move. That would be the somatic nervous system. Others are going to be attached to your organs, like your heart, your lungs, your stomach, and organs like that, and it helps them to do their job. So those we call the autonomic, and you can think of that as automatic because those things we don't really control. I mean, my stomach is digesting right now because I just ate lunch, but I don't really control that. So that's autonomic nervous system. And then the autonomic nervous system will break down one more time. And it has to do with the nerves that are involved in getting us worked up, aroused, excited, and those nerves that are involved in calming us down. So let's take a look at the sympathetic now versus the parasympathetic nervous system. Here you can see the difference between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. Over here with the pink bubbles, you can see that this person is in a sympathetic state, meaning that his autonomic nervous system is speeding him up. It's arousing him. It's causing his pupils to dilate. It's causing his heart to beat really fast. It's causing his lungs to breathe quickly and shallowly. Notice that his stomach and intestines, his digestion is inhibited. He's got to run away from a snake, or he's got to fight the snake. Fight or flight reaction, we call this sometimes. So there's no point in him digesting right now. But he is getting worked up because he's ready to do something. And that feeds into anxiety, as you can imagine. And we'll talk about that a little bit more when we talk about anxiety. By contrast, over here in the blue bubbles, you can see what the parasympathetic nervous system does. It calms everything down. It slows everything down. And remember that collectively, the parasympathetic and the sympathetic are part of the autonomic nervous system. These are all our glands that work on their own. We really don't have to do much to them. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about the brain's right and left hemispheres. The left hemisphere of the brain controls the right side of the body, and the right hemisphere of the brain controls the left side of the body. They are connected by a band of fibers, which are actually neurons, called the corpus callosum. And that allows them to talk to each other and get, there's lots of communication between the two sides of the brain in the normal brain. However, in some people, that band of fibers has been cut. And they did this for a reason, as a treatment for epilepsy in years past. What they would do is they would cut that band of fibers in the middle. And when they did, sometimes people would behave as if they had two brains. For example, my right hand picks out something from the closet to wear, and then my left hand picks out something else from the closet, and I'm holding two things going like, what do I wear? It's almost as if each side of the body was controlled by a different brain. So because these people were so interesting, we did a lot of case studies on the people, and you can read about this a little bit more in your book. But through these case studies, we've learned that the left side of the brain seems to be the side that controls language. So the left side of our brains, when you have a stroke in your left side or you get damage to your left side, a lot of times language will go away. whereas the right hemisphere of the brain tends to control emotion and some of the more complex sort of emotional aspects of language. So there's emotion in language, right? And so without that emotion, the language would be rather dull. The way that I'm speaking would be like really monotone if I didn't have emotion in it. So the right hemisphere seems to be involved in the emotional aspects of how we behave. And the left hemisphere, we know, controls the language. Okay, well, in the next video, I'm going to get onto the brain and the spinal cord and some parts of the brain. Thanks, guys, for listening.